Okay, this is the official good morning to our ECM discourse, our matinee. We are trying out a new time of doing the discourse on Sunday morning. Yeah, hello to David, hello to London.
Hi. Hi, Vienna.
So it's 1 hour earlier for you, so thank you for getting up so early.
My pleasure.
And hello also to our guests. I can also see one very dear colleague from Berlin. Yeah, and of course, good morning to our participants. So let me introduce David Rooney. I'm very happy that we at least see us online now. And next time, hopefully, really in person. We met, I think, 2 or 3 years ago in London when we were visiting the Science Museum in London to see the new display of the mathematics gallery, which was curated by David. And yeah, there we met, and I was following you now the last years, and you know that I really like your curatorial work. And David is curator, historian, geographer, and writer. As I mentioned, he was formerly keeper of technologies and engineering at the Science Museum in London, and the lead curator of the new math gallery in the Winton Gallery, which was designed by Zaha Hadid. But I think you will also talk about this. He's also working in the curating of historic sites, as you maybe also saw on the picture of the discourse announcement. And yeah, and David was suggesting to present his curatorial work from the past years, and especially with the focus of science and technology museums and exhibitions. So please start, David.
Thank you very much, Martina and Beatrice, and thank you all for turning up on a wet Sunday morning. This is quite new for me, so bear with me. I'm going to try and share the screen now. Do you see the screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, fantastic. So I thought what I'd like to talk about this morning is some challenges that I think may seem to be particular to science, technology, engineering, or mathematics museums. And I'm going to focus on some case studies, particularly the Mathematics Gallery, as Martina mentioned. But I think these issues raise wider curatorial issues, perhaps that spread outside of the science and technology museums world. And so I'll raise those wider points, those wider discussion points as we go through. So I think some of the specific challenges of curating in science and technology, I'm just going to go through a very short list of some of the galleries and exhibitions that I've been involved with at the Science Museum and at the National Maritime Museum over the last few years, and how they raise some of these issues. The first, for instance, very early on when I was still a museum trainee at the Science Museum, we did an exhibition on particle physics based on the CERN particle accelerator in Europe. The challenge here is that the subject of the exhibition is subatomic particles, objects far too small ever to be seen, and yet they needed to be displayed somehow in this exhibition. But also the engineering of this particle accelerator is on a vast scale. The scientific instrument itself is something like 26 miles long. And so how can an exhibition display a subatomic particle and a 26-mile long particle accelerator in a meaningful way for non-specialist audiences? So that was quite a challenge. Another gallery that I worked on, a much larger gallery, a permanent gallery at the Science Museum, is called Making the Modern World. And the challenge here was, this was a history of industrialization. a history of the modern industrial world. Another challenge here, which again was about scale, was how do you display an aeroplane and something the size of, I don't know, a transistor in the same gallery and accord the same status to each of those two objects if you're displaying some world firsts or some icons of industry. But also a challenge in that gallery was, if you're going to display a series of world firsts, objects that changed the world, how do you prevent it from just looking like some kind of uncritical march of progress? How can you talk about the non-exceptional objects, the landscape of science and technology that these exceptional objects emerged from? I worked at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, the National Maritime Museum, and we did a series of 4 galleries there about time. This was quite a challenge because, of course, time is an abstract concept which not even the finest time scientists can define. So how do you put on meaningful object-based displays on a subject which doesn't really exist? And furthermore, how can you do that without simply showing a series of clocks? Back at the Science Museum, I worked on a series of exhibitions about climate change. Some challenges here about, of course, complex science, but also about politics. And the relationship between science and technology and politics is something that's particularly interesting to me, because, of course, to think that science and technology is somehow neutral is absurd. Then 2 exhibitions or galleries which I'll focus on for the rest of the presentation. I'll come back to this one, but in 2012 I curated an exhibition about Alan Turing, the mathematician and computer scientist. This was a very small temporary exhibition, but some real challenges here. On the one hand, the scientific and technological work that Alan Turing did was notoriously complex, abstract, or abstruse, difficult even for the finest mathematicians then to grasp. So how can a meaningful exhibit about those scientific ideas or technical ideas be mounted for the widest possible audience in a national museum? But also this was an exhibition which was about a person. So this was about a biographical story of Alan Turing. The particular story of Alan Turing is very challenging for those who know the history of that mathematician. And what is the role of a science museum in telling challenging social and emotional, moral stories? And also, how can you avoid an exhibition like that being a hagiography of somebody, of a singular presentation of a so-called great man of history? What about the landscape of people and ideas who worked with Alan Turing, supported him, inspired him, and so on? And finally, and I'll talk quite a lot about this, I'm afraid, but I do think it raises some of the issues that are worth considering more widely. As Martina mentioned, the Mathematics Gallery at the Science Museum that opened in 2016, and that's a permanent gallery, which realistically means it'll be there for 30 or 40 years. Challenges are fairly clear on how to curate a mathematics gallery. I'll come on to those at some length. I'm not a mathematician, and I'm not specifically a historian of mathematics either, although I am a historian of science and technology. And the challenge really for the Science Museum back in 2012, when they decided to start a new mathematics gallery project, was to decide what the Science Museum's visitors would want from a gallery of mathematics. The picture up on the screen now shows the former Mathematics and Computing Gallery from the Science Museum, which opened in 1975. I'd love to be able to show you around it. Of course, it's been removed now. I'll show you a couple of pictures of it. It wasn't just that this gallery had dated badly and needed to be replaced. It's my opinion that it was not a good gallery from the start. It was a gallery which I originally thought might make sense to people who already liked mathematics. Maybe it was a gallery for them. But in the research that I did for the new mathematics gallery, where I spoke to many dozens of mathematicians at all levels in the field to find out if they liked the old gallery, they said, no, we don't like it either, because it doesn't represent our subject. It doesn't represent our world. I'll come on in a moment to a few things, the sorts of things that gallery used to display. But I came to the conclusion that it wasn't even a gallery for insiders. It wasn't even a gallery for people who already got mathematics. So we decided instead to set that aside and think, what would our visitors, the Science Museum's visitors, want? And when I say the Science Museum's visitors, I mean the broadest possible audience. The millions of people who visit the Science Museum every year. What might they want or expect from a gallery of mathematics? And it's not really very difficult, actually, when you start talking to audiences. And forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn in any of this. These are my opinions only. I'm not speaking any longer for the Science Museum. But if you were thinking about going with your family or your friends on a Sunday afternoon to the museum for an afternoon out, what might you want from a maths gallery? Would you want to learn some mathematics? Would you really want to go and spend some time struggling into central London, in this case, to go and learn mathematics? Does an afternoon of doing mathematics fill you with joy? And I think the answer which we believed was that for the vast majority of the Science Museum's audience, that would absolutely not be the case. But we wanted to base our assumptions on some research. The Science Museum does a great deal of audience research, has done now for, I don't know, 30, 35 years. In 2009, the Science Museum carried out a major piece of research on visitors' attitudes towards mathematics. And the research showed absolutely clearly that for the vast majority of people, mathematics was a subject which, at best, they were glad that they had left behind at school. And they were perfectly content to believe that it was important, but they were very happy that other people were doing it and that they could leave it behind. At worst, there were feelings of fear or even hatred of that subject. Really strongly held feelings, emotional feelings about mathematics as a subject. Probably, I think, based on their experiences at school. So the idea of encouraging people who believe that mathematics is a subject not for them, and it's a subject which they believe they do not like or has no connection to their lives, trying to encourage people like that across the threshold of a gallery about mathematics is a real challenge. The research that we did in 2009 said that confidence levels in the subject of maths in the population of the UK were at rock bottom, and some people felt a real sense of failure. One adult participant in the research said this: at school, if you didn't get the answer right in mathematics the first time, you were reduced to nothing. So the thought of mathematics now makes me break out in a cold sweat. These are really strongly held views, and this was shared across the vast majority of the audience of the Science Museum. So it seems likely then that going to a museum to do some maths is not going to be a recipe for success. However, all was not lost in our research with our audiences. The research showed very clearly that people are almost universally interested in the real world impacts of mathematics on their lives, on our lives. The connections between mathematics and the life that I live, tangible expressions of the work that mathematicians do. So that's fantastic. That gives us a way in. If people are interested in their lives, well, this isn't really difficult curatorially. If you start with things which people feel have a connection with them, they're likely to have an interest, and once they're interested, then they're likely to read what you say. Here are some more stills from the old 1975 gallery. Now look, if you're a mathematician and you're interested in conic sections, and if you're interested in topology, if perhaps you are a collector of slide rules and other unusual instruments used by a very small subsection of mathematicians, then this might have been the gallery for you. But look at it, you know, there is nothing designed to put you off more than what you can see on the screen there, in my view. If you already think that mathematics is distant from your life, then seeing some weird shapes which express some equations, it's not the best way to get people interested in mathematics. So the point is, was the new mathematics gallery to be about teaching people some mathematics? And I'm not going to labor the point. The short answer was no, because what the old gallery missed was that much wider cultural point. Don't worry, there are very few slides with words on, mostly pictures. The wider cultural point, which is that mathematics has been driven by our most fundamental human concerns through history. So these are fundamental human concerns that we all understand: life and death, war and peace, money, trade, travel. Mathematics has a strong and deep connection historically with those fundamental human concerns, which we can all understand are important. So let's approach the topic of mathematics through those real world human concerns of life and death and war and peace and money and trade and so on. In fact, those 6 sections became the sections that the gallery was divided into. But let's also look at our definitions here. What do we mean by mathematics? And who do we mean by a mathematician? Because that, I think, is where many of the problems have arisen in the public understanding of mathematics. The idea that mathematicians are an elite group of people who are up there and are very clever and they're not you is unhelpful. So our definition of mathematics was any kind of mathematical practice that has been carried on in, we chose, the last 400 years. So that might mean arithmetic in a shop, if you're a shopkeeper or you're buying goods. It might mean the work done in universities. It might mean the work done if you're an engineer or an architect. Any mathematical practice is mathematics and therefore can be included in our new gallery. Secondly, who are mathematicians? Well, you'll clearly see the point I'm trying to make. Anybody who has ever carried out any kind of mathematical practice in this new definition of mathematics for this gallery alone, all those people are mathematicians. So, of course, we are all mathematicians. We all carry out mathematical practice in one way or another. So this gallery is about all of us, and it's about our lives and it's about our concerns. So that feels like a way in to tell some stories that might grab people's attention, from which you can then perhaps dive down into some of the more technical aspects of mathematics. I'll give you a very quick description of the new gallery, the facts and figures, if you like. It opened in 2016. It's a medium-sized gallery at the Science Museum, 900 square meters. It was designed, as Martina mentioned, by Zaha Hadid Architects. I will use the initials ZHA from now on. Most of the engineering was done by Arup. It was a £5 million gallery, which in cost per square meter at the Science Museum is absolutely standard. This was not an expensive gallery, and it was certainly not any more expensive because Zaha Hadid was to design it. This was the standard cost per square meter for the Science Museum. And by the way, it came on absolutely on budget and on time. Very importantly, the new gallery has far fewer objects in it on display, 120 compared with about 700 in the same space in the former gallery. Very broad audience, I've mentioned, and the success of it, we were delighted that it got 1.2 million visitors in the first year alone, which is almost half of all visitors to the Science Museum. This was unheard of. This was, even in our wildest dreams, we did not expect so many people to visit this gallery. It's on the second floor. It's quite difficult to find, actually, in the orientation of the Science Museum. and people were seeking it out. And it had, I'm pleased to say, it had a lot of acclaim, not just from the critics, not just from the architecture press, but from the public. And we carried out a lot of visitor research afterwards, in the months after it opened, to see how successful it had been in meeting our ambitions. And it showed, when I say total success, I think it was 99% of visitors in our research came away with the learning outcome that we hoped for. And I will find the remaining 1%. I will track them down. And very, very quickly, so we went out to tender to find designers or architects for this gallery, of course, as any major project has to do. We went through the OJU process, and a number of architectural practices submitted tenders, including Zaha Hadid Architects, including ZHA, and as history relates, ZHA won the competition, and it was to have been the world's first public museum gallery designed by Zaha Hadid. Since she passed away during the project, it will of course now be the world's only public museum gallery designed by her. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenge of her death during the project, actually a bit later on, because I think it's really significant. The team spirit that's built up in a project is hugely important and a major challenge. And what she presented was the most astonishing, the most audacious concept of what a maths gallery could be, because we'd put a list of potential objects which we wanted to display, a list of like 12, the biggest, the smallest, the oldest, the newest, and so on, just to give the designers something to pitch. We didn't say that that full-size aeroplane that you can see on the screen had to be in the center of the gallery. It's quite a small aeroplane. It's quite a big gallery. It could have gone pretty much anywhere. And what Zaha Hadid chose to do, she herself, by the way, was a mathematician. She trained as a mathematician before she trained in architecture. And her architectural work and the work of her company still is very strongly motivated by mathematics, by algorithms. The geometries are in many ways algorithmic. And she said, okay, well, I'm going to take your central, I'm going to make your aircraft central. She said, and what I'll do is I'm going to take the mathematical equations that aerodynamicists use when they're modeling the flow of air over aircraft wings. So these are the mathematical equations used in the aircraft industry to this day to model the airflow over the wings. And she says, I'm going to model the airflow mathematically over your aircraft, and then I'm going to make it physical. And so the curved shapes that you can see behind the aircraft there are not just a beautiful lit sculpture, they are the solutions to the mathematical equations of airflow over our aircraft. Not just any aircraft, but our aircraft. She laser scanned it. So that structure behind the aircraft is literally a model of the aircraft, but it's a mathematical model of the aircraft. Moreover, when you see the exhibit in plan, and normally I'd be waving my arms at this, but I'm sorry that I can't. Actually, can you see my mouse? My mouse cursor. All right. So these are the wings. These are the wings of the aircraft, and this is where the fuselage is. So the propellers here, and the view that we just saw was from this point to the right, right? Okay. So you're looking along here, and you can see that actually all of these are showcases containing the objects, and every single showcase also follows a line which is a solution to those mathematical equations. So without laboring this point, the entire physicality of the gallery was generated by ZHA using mathematics from the central exhibit, that aircraft. So the entire gallery architecture has been created using the subject of the gallery itself. Now that is just beautiful. I mean, it doesn't matter whether visitors get that. We do explain that in the gallery, but not everybody will see that film. But what a beautiful concept to say mathematics is so pervasive in our lives that this entire space was generated using it in the most exquisite ways. So the gallery is divided into 6 sections, and they are the sections that I mentioned earlier: war and peace, life and death, and so on. So you'll see in the distance, you know, a panel which says war and peace or money. You might move towards that. Each zone has about 3 or 4 stories. Each story has one main object and maybe 3 or 4 other objects. That's it. 120 objects in total. And for those interested in interpretation strategies, a really flat interpretation hierarchy for this gallery. This isn't a gallery full of text and screens and hands-on exhibits. This is a gallery which is, the intention is it's a beautiful space which affects your emotions and objects and the bare minimum of anything else. Very flat hierarchy. You have gallery introduction text, so one at each of the 2 entrances. Each of the 6 sections has one of these, 50 words, actually fewer, 30 words on these. Each of the stories, 3 or 4 per section, has a story panel, and then each object has a label. That's it. So really, really flat hierarchy. And it was designed for you to not to read it from the top down in that hierarchy, because that's not how visitors act. You just go up to any object that looks interesting to you, you read its label, and then you can work out from there, which has proved to be very successful. And it's certainly a practice which I think I'd probably done this implicitly in the past, but this was the first time we did it explicitly. We wrote the text so that it would work from the object outwards. You didn't have to read the section panel first. Discussion topic 1, which we can come back to when we all come together. And these are some of the questions or the challenges put to me by the many people who had an interest in this gallery as we curated it. And I was working on this for 4 years. It was a live project for about 2.5 years, and I had 1.5 years before that to come up with a vision and to engage the community. Surely mathematics isn't about objects. Surely mathematics is about equations and ideas and theorems. And if it is about objects, I was told, surely it's things like slide rules. Surely it's the tools that some mathematicians used to use in the past. Or it's models of mathematical equations, those weird shapes with spikes or curves, which some mathematicians use to make an equation in 3 dimensions. Well, that's not very helpful. First of all, if there are no objects involved, then doing an object-based gallery is not going to succeed. Secondly, we've already tried a gallery full of slide rules and it was terrible. But it's a solvable problem, of course it is, because if you've got that underlying logic that I expressed earlier, that mathematics is any mathematical practice that's ever been carried out in the world, and that everybody is in one way or another a mathematician, then that underlying logic means that anything can be displayed in this gallery, any object. If you believe strongly enough that mathematics is everywhere, then any object becomes a candidate for display. Now, you've got to be really careful, of course, because otherwise it just becomes a jumble sale of anything. There has to be a logic. So then the next approach is starting from 2 ends of that problem. There's the intellectual history. There's the history of mathematics or mathematical practice, which suggests candidate objects. You know, if you're reading about the history of calculus, you might find when you're reading those history books that the differential analyzer, a machine developed in the 1930s to solve differential equations, you might find that that's really important. So that gives you some suggestions of objects that might be included. But at the other end of the scale, and this is very much as important as the history, is as curators, and I use the term curator very broadly, as anybody who's involved in the making of an exhibition involving objects, you go to your collections and you look around and you look at every shelf, you look in every cupboard, and you allow the objects to speak to you. You allow the objects to tell you the story about that could be about mathematics. You use your instincts as curators to sniff out a potential story. And it's my strongly held view that curating, in the widest sense, is a craft, not a science. That it cannot be done on Microsoft Excel spreadsheets. It cannot be done from your desk, and it cannot be done purely from books. It has to be a craft or even an art, which is about going and feeling objects. And I'm talking specifically about science and technology curating here. In the art world, of course, it's a different set of challenges. But it's absolutely about letting objects speak to you to tell you their stories. And you can't get that any way other than walking around the stores for years and years and years and years. Everybody else, right? So I was the curator of one particular set of collections, and but luckily I had the keys to everyone else's rooms. So I was able to pick anything I wanted. All right, so what does that mean in reality? What did that mean in reality in the Science Museum's maths galleries? Let's look at some actual objects. So that object list, that candidate list, started to assemble itself by a very long iterative process of reading lots of books which suggest candidates of objects to look for, looking round the stores to find objects that might be interesting or to find gaps which you might want to fill, talking to mathematicians, talking to historians, talking to school teachers who teach mathematics, talking to engineers and architects, and just listening for them talking not just about the ideas in their field, but about the objects, the material culture that they engage with. And keeping a note of all of these and slowly building up a very long list from which you can then start to see the patterns form. On the screen, you can see that the Maths Gallery contains objects as diverse as an actual aeroplane, a set of human skulls from the 19th century, an abacus, some kind of electronic device made by a protege of Alan Turing. And I'm going to just tell a very small number of stories because I don't want to take too long on this. There are two objects there. The object on the left of the screen, which is about the height of me plus a half. So it's a very tall object. It's a hydraulic computer. It's a 1940s computer which uses the flow of water to represent the flow of money in the British economy. This is a model of the British economy in, I think it was 1950, and how that economy works. It was made by an engineer and economist, Bill Phillips, at the London School of Economics, and then a batch of about a dozen were made, and you can find them all around the world now. A couple of them still working. You can see the videos of them on YouTube. So this used to be on display in the former Maths and Computing Gallery, and it was displayed as an amusing dead end in the history of computing. Isn't it funny that they would use water rather than electrons to model the equations that it was believed the economy worked to? But of course, when you look at it in its historical context, it becomes incredibly important. The reason they used water to model the flow of money around the British economy was because water is a very good material to model the flow of money. So if you look on the front of that, you've got all kinds of dials and taps and gauges and things you can adjust. And each of those are things like the interest rate or the size of the economy, or effectively, as the water flows around, any change in one part of the economy, you'll see very slowly, as equilibrium is reached again, you'll see the effect on how much consumers are saving, how much consumers are spending, how much the government is investing. It's astonishingly important because a whole generation of economists who studied at the London School of Economics from the 50s through to the 70s were taught that you can understand how the economy works using fairly simple mathematics. Here's a model. Now, those people are, where are they now? Where are the people who studied maths in the 60s or studied economics in the 60s or 70s as 18 or 19-year-olds? Well, they're probably now in government treasuries or running the central bank, or they're possibly the chief finance officer for a major blue chip company like Ford or whatever. So they've bought into a mathematical worldview. You can understand the economy using deterministic equations. Now, when I stand in front of this object giving tours in the Mathematics Gallery live, I mentioned the 2008 financial crash and talk about how that showed very vividly what happens when you believe that the models always apply. The models used by economists apply within a fixed set of behaviors. When those behaviors are breached, the models no longer apply. So if you still use the model, the economy will crash. Nobody gets a pay rise for a decade. None of you will get jobs. This section of the gallery, the money section, is next to how the economy works, is next to a section called gambling. And it's entirely coincidental that how the economy works and gambling are both next to each other. Actually, probability is really significant. So as soon as you get into these stories, you get into ideas like probability, and you understand the real world and significance of understanding how the economy works and getting that wrong. The object on the right, and forgive me that this isn't light-hearted Sunday morning entertainment, but this is really, really important in my opinion of what curating can and should be, because I really, really think it's important that any exhibition or gallery in a science or technology museum must evoke an emotional response in visitors. It's really, really important that people feel emotional when they're visiting a gallery about science or technology, because if they're not getting the point. So I feel unashamed in trying to affect people's emotions. I also believe quite strongly, and forgive me, anyone who's in the public popularization of maths world, I don't think maths is fun. And I think there's a view which tells people who don't like maths is fun. Let's do some puzzles. And maths isn't fun. Maths is about the real world, and the real world is hard. The real world is often painful. And mathematics is absolutely at the heart of that. So on the left, how the economy works, the pain might be that you don't get a job because the economy is tanked. On the right is a machine made at a London hospital, and it's called the London Hospital Survival Predictor. And it was used by clinicians at the hospital to feed in data of heart readings from heart attack patients for many, many years. So the ECG traces that would be taken if you came to hospital with a heart attack, they would measure your heart. Those traces going back dozens of years. What a clinician would do when a new patient came in, they would try to understand, how does the heart trace of the person in front of me compare with all of those I've seen in the past? Therefore, how likely is my patient to live or die, based on what I can see here? What this machine did was it used pattern recognition to effectively predict the probability of any patient living or dying. And when you look at the dial on the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see on the left is a light marked IBD, and on the right is a dial marked S. And when the button was pressed, the needle would move towards one or other of those extremes. S means survive, and IBD means irreversible brain damage. So whilst the clinicians had the final say over whether to try to revive a patient, this machine, this mathematical machine, would predict with some degree of success whether they would live or die. This is really, really important stuff, right? This is stuff which any visitor might look at. When they realize what they're looking at, they might start paying attention to this gallery about mathematics, which they thought had nothing to do with their life. let's lighten up a little bit. What we've got here is on the left-hand side, we've got a 17th century calculator. It's actually Britain's first pocket calculator from the 17th century. On the right, we've got some software from 1983, Lotus 123. It's a spreadsheet software. It's like Microsoft Excel, but it came out a little bit earlier. On the left is the sort of object you might expect to see in a maths gallery, because it's beautiful, it's brass, it's from the 17th century. You dial the numbers in you want to add together, and it gives you the answer. On the right is a crappy box of software from the 80s. Why would you put that in a showcase on its own? I was really interested in contrast here, because on the left, you'll see a quotation by the diarist Samuel Pepys, who saw this machine in the 17th century, described it as very pretty but not very useful. And of course he was right. That pocket calculator did not change the world. Lotus 123 changed the world of finance overnight. And I was told this by a hedge fund owner who we had to some of our events as we were planning the gallery. And he said, what you should display in your gallery is a copy of Lotus 123, because it changed the world of finance overnight. And it made some people billions of dollars because they could model their financial predictions live in real time on their desktop, rather than having to send them for computing overnight. So I like playing tricks a little bit by putting something which looks boring, mundane, a box of software, next to something beautiful and shiny and exquisite, and saying one of these is really important and one of them isn't. And it's the other way from what you think. Okay, don't get me wrong, I'm not all about mundane, boring things. I think having wonderful, exquisite icons on display is also great. This is Charles Babbage's analytical engine. For those who are interested in the history of maths and computing, or if you're into steampunk, or if you're interested in the history of women in science, you might know about the story of Ada Lovelace and of Charles Babbage. This could have been the world's first modern computer. From the 1840s, in fact, only a small piece was made after Charles Babbage's death, and that's it on display. But it was Ada Lovelace who saw in Charles Babbage's designs for an analytical engine, effectively she came up with the idea of modern symbolic computing, the idea that a computer can do more than calculate. If the numbers that it's working on can stand for other things, then a computer can compute anything computable. It's an absolute icon for all sorts of reasons, and there it is on show in front of you. Let's move on, and I'm going to move on from that because time's moving too fast. This is a really nice exhibit, which on the left is a machine for predicting the tides around the UK, but on the right is a new acquisition the Science Museum made for this gallery, which is a model of the North Sea. So this is an electronic model on the right-hand side, which models the North Sea, and it models the height of the North Sea. So what it's doing is modeling storm surges, which might cause huge floods on the coastlines of the UK and the rest of Europe. And in the 1950s, there was a terrible North Sea flood caused by a storm surge. The very long story short, the person who made that machine was a man called Shizuo Ishiguro. His son, one of his children, his son Kazuo Ishiguro, is the novelist who, since the gallery opened, won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And he was actually one of the first visitors to the gallery. His father had passed away some years before, and Kazuo's mother approached the Science Museum to say, we've got this machine in the shed, in the garden, which we think is important in the history of mathematics. But we don't really know too much about it other than what our father told us about it, which was that he helps to make the world a safer place after the North Sea flood by modeling storm surges using mathematics still used today. And there he is sitting in front of it. He was one of the first visitors. He was interviewed for the Guardian newspaper. And he said some really interesting things. He said about his father's work as an oceanographer, as an ocean mathematician, He said, my father didn't think of it as a job at all. It was something he obsessively thought about the whole time. Kazuo then said, that was my model. So he learned from his father the idea about obsessively thinking about something the whole time. That was his model, which he then, I think, applied to his work, which a few months later won him the Nobel Prize in Literature. Whatever your interest, whatever your background, wherever you come from, we wanted to make displays in this gallery which made some sense to you. I'm going to pass over that as well. Wherever you come from in the world, you might find your part of the world represented in this gallery. Now, it's largely a story about Western mathematics, for the simple reason that the Science Museum's collections are strong in the history of Western mathematics, and they're not strong in the history of non-Western mathematics. But there are some glimpses of an older mathematical tradition, whether that's an astrolabe, the one on the left-hand side, a mathematical instrument which was made in Lahore, in today's Pakistan, which was literally a model of the universe, a mathematical instrument that allowed you to predict anything from the time to the future. On the right is a Western equivalent, an astronomical clock. So if you like beautiful things, they're here too. If you play the lottery, here is the first lottery machine. If you're interested in design, maybe you visit the Victoria and Albert Museum over the road rather than the Science Museum. Maybe you're interested in the work of designers and their relationship with mathematics, or architects and their relationship with mathematics. Maybe you're an engineer. Maybe you like going around looking at skyscrapers. Maybe you like urban exploration. Maybe you like concrete. And all of these things you'll find have stories to do with mathematics, because mathematics is everywhere. And what we wanted to do was to make this rich, visually appealing landscape of objects from the last 400 years, displayed in ways which encourage you to look at those objects as carefully as you wish to, and to give you the space to do that. The reason why we had so few objects is so everything can have plenty of space around it for you to look. Whatever your interest, whatever your background, you might find something here, and you just need to find one thing which speaks to you, which might change your view of what mathematics is, and which might cause you to leave that gallery after your visit, which might just have been 10 minutes, thinking, well, I didn't realize maths was so important in my life. And maybe that'll just affect the conversations, if you've got kids, that you have with your kids, deciding which subjects to study at school or at university. Maybe if you're running a company, it might affect whether you employ a few mathematicians to help you with some modeling. Or maybe it just means that the conversations that you have in your daily lives about mathematics move away from this idea of geeks in universities doing these abstract things over here that I don't care about or understand, to seeing that it's just another practice that we all get involved with. All right. Another question that I often get asked is, why did we work with an architect and not a designer? Because this wasn't a new building, this was an existing room. Why wouldn't you go out to the design world rather than the architecture world? And really, my experience of working with architects in general, and with Zaha Hadid Architects in particular, this was the most astonishing project I've ever worked on, in the relationship between the museum team and the architects. Because of course, what architects do isn't just build new buildings. And of course, architects aren't just interested in the external aesthetic appearance of buildings. Architects are experts in how people relate in three dimensions to the world around them. And isn't that what making a museum gallery is? You know, what museums are about is the art of the three dimensions. Otherwise, you're a book or you're a website or a podcast. What do museums have? We have physicality. And if it's a museum with collections, then we have three-dimensional collections. So of course, it seems to me that architects are absolutely in the world of curating, and curators are in the world of architecture, because this is about how people relate as they walk across that threshold, or even as they glimpse it in the distance, with a three-dimensional experience in front of them. That's what the Maths Gallery is. It's not a didactic subject teaching you some mathematics. This is about a physical landscape that you can explore, which becomes an emotional landscape, an intellectual landscape, a political landscape. And our relationship with ZHA was astonishing. It was astonishingly good. I'm still very close friends with the lead architect who we worked with on that. So, I mean, we can talk about this in the discussion perhaps afterwards about what you get when you get an architect, which I'm happy to talk about at great length, actually. Here are some snapshots of what a ZHA construction site looks like during construction. And you can see the curved shapes being formed there, the floor being laid, the aircraft in situ wrapped up. It was the most wonderful building sites to have to work on, let me tell you. The third discussion topic is about, I'm sorry to use the terrible word stakeholders, but this is about the people around you who have a stake in what this gallery might be, or this exhibition. So, and if I sound like I'm being disrespectful to those people, I genuinely do not mean to. I love all of the people who have ever been around any project that I've worked on, but it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge working with people. Right, so take this specific example of a mathematics gallery. There's a lot of people in the world of policy, politics, museums, education, parents, society in general, who really care about what a maths gallery at the National Museum can and should be. There's a lot riding on this. If we believe, and if as governments and educational leaders tell us that maths is one of the most significant challenges, a better engagement between the population and mathematics for countries to move forward, then the Maths Gallery at the Science Museum in London becomes very, very significant. So of course there are lots of people around you who have a view on what should be in the gallery. But as the lead curator of the gallery, it's my job to make the gallery. And it's not possible to make a gallery which includes everybody's expectations of what it should have in it. What shall I say about that? We were very fortunate in being able to draw on the expertise and public status of some very significant figures in the world of mathematics. Just very briefly, this is a bit of a cast list of who was involved. The gallery was entirely funded. That £5 million was entirely funded by David and Claudia Harding, who run who work in the financial sector, and this was the biggest single donation that the Science Museum had then received, and it was very unusual for the Science Museum to receive full funding for a £5 million gallery from a single pair of people. The architect, you know, but we appointed an external advisory panel, and this is answering the question that I've raised. There are 8 people on that list, and there are 2 very eminent historians of mathematics. There are 2 very eminent mathematicians, 2 very eminent maths educators, leaders in the world of maths education, and 2 people representing the use of mathematics in industry, in very high stakes industries. And that felt like a really interesting way to hedge these various interests in mathematics, from history through its current practice, through how it's taught, through to its economic value, if you like. And these people were there for us to call on, for us to run ideas by, and to keep me grounded when my ideas were too far-fetched or ridiculous. We appointed, as you can see, a fellow of modern mathematics. This was a part-time role for a mathematician from Oxford University, who read every word that I wrote to make sure that when I was talking about actual mathematics, that I wasn't making stupid mistakes. And then we were able to broaden the voices beyond the Science Museum in the book that accompanied. This isn't an advert for you to buy the book, by the way, but of course you should. The essayists, people who wrote essays at the back of the book, provided very different takes on various aspects of mathematics. So how do you can't do a gallery on mathematics without including this. We can talk a lot about this, but the decision-making structure in the Science Museum was that each project group has a single lead person for each discipline, if you like, who sit together on a group. So there's the lead curator, the lead interpretation, the lead conservator, the press and public relations lead, and so on. And a group of about 8 people, each of whom represented a much larger group of people. So I was the lead curator, so my responsibility was to engage with all of the curators and the wider curatorial world, but for me to be responsible, ultimately, for the decisions that were made curatorially. That meant that you had a very tight decision-making structure. You also had a single project director who had a very clear vision of what this gallery should do. And she led this gallery very strongly and gave it a very senior level strong voice, which meant that when problems arose, she was able to decide, rather than letting decisions not be made, which in my experience can be a risk in some museum projects. We were able to make decisions, we were able to be decisive, which enabled this project to be brought in on time, on budget, and to be, we hope, successful. So there's a lot that we can talk about. How do you manage stakeholders? I'm going to skip over this, actually. I'm going to skip over that. How can you have a mathematics gallery without any mathematics in it? Is a question that I got asked and still do occasionally get asked. And this is not a gallery for teaching mathematics. The ambition for this gallery is for people to leave after their visit believing that mathematics is about more than what they thought, about different people from what they thought, and that it has a relationship, a strong relationship with their lives. It just seems to me that the idea that you could set some puzzles in a gallery, some mathematical puzzles, some simple maths that people can do in a gallery just seems to be, I mean, pointless is hardly the word. Mathematics is difficult. That's why you study it for many years at school and at university if you take it that far, and then through your life. So if you study mathematics, if you're given a mathematical puzzle to do in a gallery when your visit might last 7 minutes or 10 minutes, it's going to have to be very, very simple maths. And even very simple mathematical puzzles, most people will get wrong. I would get them wrong. So if I did a maths puzzle I knew was the simplest possible puzzle, because of course that's what you're going to be given in a maths gallery, and then when I get it wrong or can't do it, it's just going to reinforce my view that maths really isn't for me. I'm glad that I left it behind, and I'll walk out that gallery still loathing mathematics. What we want people to walk out of the gallery is thinking mathematics is more interesting than I thought, and it's closer to me than I thought. And maybe then, well, everyone's got Wikipedia. If you become interested in differential equations after having seen the story we tell about the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which is a story relating to a differential analyzer, well, you can just look them up. Trying to do some differential equations in the gallery? Ridiculous, in my view. Let me very quickly move on to the second case study, and this is to really reinforce what I was saying earlier about emotion. So the Alan Turing and his Life and Legacy exhibition, which is a very small temporary exhibition in 2012, really helped me work through some ideas that we then did much bigger and more confidently in the mathematics gallery that followed. This was to celebrate the centenary of Alan Turing, the great mathematician and code breaker at UK's Bletchley Park, the person who came up with the first theoretical description of what a modern computer turned out to be. He worked in biology. He had a very multifaceted life. He worked in early ideas about machine intelligence, what became artificial intelligence. But his life was very short. He died when he was in his early 40s from, it's believed, suicide. owing to his homosexuality at a time when homosexual activity was against the law in the UK. And the story, which some of you may know, and if you don't, there are some very good books written about this. There's a very much wider social and political and human story about how this great scientist and great technologist effectively was hounded for the last years of his life by the British state. He was prosecuted and convicted of sexual offences. He was given a chemical treatment that castrated him, and he took his life soon afterwards. Now, the question that the Science Museum had as we were curating this is, to what extent is that human story, that social story, that biography, a story which should be told in a science museum or the Science Museum in London? To what extent does that have any relation with the scientific and technological work he did? How much should we tell? And how hard should we tell it for an exhibition which is aimed at families as well as adults, families with the youngest children? What's appropriate? And so, again, sorry that this isn't a fun Sunday morning, but this is the real world. How much should you talk about sexuality and suicide in an exhibition about computers and artificial intelligence? And to cut the very long story slightly short, we decided, after a lot of thought and a lot of discussions with groups outside the museum, that how can you possibly do an exhibition about Alan Turing's life and legacy without including his life? And it was borne out. I realize time is passing, so I'll cut this very short. It was borne out in the audience research afterwards, which again was very strong in its findings, that people felt, I got to know Alan Turing and also many people around Alan Turing, so it helped to sort of say that he wasn't this lone genius, he was very much a social figure. I felt closer to him in this exhibition, which made me care about the work he did in maths and science and engineering. But if we'd just gone in and told the stories about his science, nobody would get in the door. But it's absolutely the case that in the final section, which talked about the work he was doing at the end of his life, which was a very sparse display, that many people came out of there very upset and in many cases in tears, because they were so angry at what they had just learned about this mathematician. And it may not be fun, but those people cared then about science and mathematics and engineering and computing in ways that perhaps they hadn't done before. There were many challenges in the mathematics gallery, not least staying on the emotional journey here, the fact that Zaha Hadid died about 2/3 of the way through this project. We, of course, didn't work directly through the project with Zaha Hadid. She appointed a team, as is always the case. But it's absolutely the case that our lead architect was in weekly meetings with Zaha Hadid through the project, and that she was making decisions at all levels of detail about this. It wasn't a case of a sketch drawing done at the start of the project to win the commission and then withdrawing. Zaha Hadid was involved throughout. And of course, for those of you who know about her work and about her company, there's a real strength of feeling in ZHA working for Zaha Hadid. So when she passed away, we had a group of people working with us from her company who all of a sudden their world had been turned upside down because this was very unexpected. And so one challenge was, how do you work with a group of architects whose world has just changed overnight, and who I think were having to think very hard and very fast while coming to terms with their own grief about how what they had to do from then on needed to deliver what they believed Zaha Hadid would have wanted. So how would they continue to drive the project forward so that the end result was what she would have expected, which was no easy challenge. And that was really, really hard for us as a client, because we shared their grief and we had a project to deliver. So we can talk about that as well. The end result for me, after many practical challenges in making this mathematics gallery, was, I genuinely think it's the piece of work that I'm proudest of, and also enjoyed the most, even though it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in a so far 25-year career. But Martina and Beatrice, I think it's probably time that I stop talking now. Is that okay? And perhaps we can have a conversation in the room.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you also for showing these nice object pictures.
I wanted to show you the gallery, but you'll see it. You'll see it sometime.
I mean, I have to advise everybody, if you go to London and if the museums are open again, then please visit the gallery. It's really worth to see. And I also realized now during your presentation that it's a bit difficult to explain the whole room, the whole feeling of the space also. So it's a real exhibition in the way that you have to enter the room to understand the whole concept very clearly. Yeah. So I also wanted to welcome Eva Kudras. I don't know, Eva, if you're still there, but here are you. Do you know, David, do you know Eva? She's the math curator from the Science Museum in Berlin.
I'm not sure that we've met, no. Hi.
You've never met. Okay, so just to introduce you, so we have assembled London, Berlin, and Vienna now. Yeah, let me open the question session now. So I'm sure that there are some questions also. Radostina?
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for this dense but very, very interesting presentation. It's really great to have some insights of the gallery. And I'm sorry that last year I was in London, but I didn't know about this gallery. I didn't visit it. So I don't know how to start my, statement or question. Maybe first to introduce myself. My background is mathematics. Maybe this is the reason that I first won the word. So I've studied and worked in this, and at one point I left it frustrated, in the sense that I couldn't see the connection, or no, not that the connection, that my political influence of what I do, or more to say my possibility not to be means for something, but to have the word how to do this something. And here comes my question, or my point. Maybe I couldn't see in the presentation of the gallery this critical point, this critical question, if mathematics is only a means to do things, to arrive at some results, or to improve whatever the economy or whatever, or also the mathematicians should have some possibility to, to learn the ethical things that they can change with their work. Because with colleagues that I've talked, they're not that interested in their ethics, how they influence the world. They're more interested to do their work. And I mean, this connection is somehow missing, or I couldn't see it in the presentation that you did, at least, between the mathematical world and the ethics of the world. I don't know if you understand my point.
I do, absolutely. And I hope that a visit would help you see. It's what I wanted. This is really quite subtle, this visit to this gallery. And of course, not everybody will see every exhibit or read every word, of course. So what we had to try to do was to make it as likely as possible that by seeing a few objects or reading a few statements, you're likely to build up a sense of the message that we wanted to get across, which absolutely was, I think the idea about ethics and mathematics is at the heart of what motivated me to see that this, to make as clear as possible to the non-mathematician audience visiting this gallery that that mathematics has an ethics, mathematics has a politics, whether that's accepted or thought about overtly all the time or not by mathematicians or by politicians or by parents or whoever, that there is a politics to mathematics, and therefore all of the stories that we tell about how the work of some mathematicians has led to this thing or this idea or plays a role in this particular world or discipline, all of the stories we were telling are about politics with a small p. And it was trying to get as much breadth as possible without looking like we were pushing a particular point of view. So there's a section called Maps and Models, which is about how mathematicians for centuries have tried to understand the world around us, like the universe, by mapping the stars using mathematics, or by mapping the oceans, or by making maps on land, cartography and so on. This feels more mathematical than some of the other sections, but then there are other sections, particularly in the life and death section, which talk about maths in medicine, in public health, and so on, where the ethics becomes much more clear. So I'm not sure whether I'm even addressing the question that you raised, but by visiting the gallery and seeing a few exhibits, I hope that you would see a strong connection between the work of mathematicians and the ethical landscape that they work in. Come back to me and ask that question again if I haven't addressed it well enough.
No, it's fine. I just wondered if your education, or maybe I can imagine that in the educational programs that you suggest, you tackle this question more deeply, depending on the public, on the groups, of course.
Well, it's definitely the case that the educational programs and the visitor events enable all of the stories, or all aspects of the story, to be told in much more depth. That's absolutely right, because of course there's that practical limit to the amount that you can impart in a gallery visit. The average gallery visit for the Science Museum is about 10 to 15 minutes. And so of course there's, you know, if you can get one thing across, that's a success. And so yes, absolutely, the programs are a way to bring these things out, to flesh them out. And yeah, the programs have been very successful too, and they're often themed and usually will bring out these ideas strongly.
We have one more comment of Eva, and one comment from which I collected in the chat. But first, Eva, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that really inspiring talk. I was very tired in the beginning, and then I was woke up 5 minutes later. So I really loved your the way you talked about the process of. That's my daughter. No, not at the moment.
She should come in. She should join.
So you told about just going to the stores for years and letting or allowing the objects to talk to you, and I wondered how that works in practice, really, because I really love to do that. Going to the stores. I work at the German Museum of Technology, and we have stores and stores and stores and things, but they are very, very badly documented, very badly documented in some cases. And they don't talk to me because I only know some technical information about that, but I don't know that the the history of usage. I don't know where they were used in which context and so on. And that, I think that is a really problem of many collections in the technical field, so that they don't focus on these stories. So you discovered the stories, but the collection itself, they don't focus on this kind of stories mostly. It's because the collections were built about many years, and from curators or persons who don't focus on that point of view. So I wondered how you discover the stories then from the objects.
I mean, that's a really good question. It's a really profound question, because it affects, I mean, presumably it affects all kinds of museums, not just science and technology museums. So, well, one answer to that would be, I worked at the Science Museum for many years. So I joined 25 years ago. I didn't work there all that time, but in that time I had lots of different jobs, which meant I moved around different collections, different subjects, gathering the right to draw more and more keys in the storerooms, and never given those key access rights back. What that meant in practice was that I had just been exposed to seeing the collections in the stores more over a longer period, but also, you know, every time I had been around the stores with other colleagues, I would have absorbed from them the stories that they have told me about the collections. You know, so I used to work in the, I'm interested in the history of technology mostly, and modern technology, but I used to work in the medical collections of the Science Museum when I was very young, in an unpacking project. So I absorbed for like a year. I heard the stories of the medical curators telling me about, you know, this room full of these amazing things. Well, this is, and it's not about how they work. That's really never what I'm interested in, I'm afraid to say. I'm sorry, that's heretical. But so one answer is that I heard them talk about their passions over 25 years, and I've tried to remember them. And they've kept coming back to me over the years. So that's one thing. The second thing is, remember when I said that I believe that curating exhibitions or galleries is a craft, not a science? Another answer to your question, or another response to your comment, is that it's impossible to describe how I find the objects with powerful stories, because it's like it's like being a sculpture. You couldn't describe how much you might have to hit to take the right amount off. You've just done it for so many years that it's in your body. It's muscle memory, or it's right. So my short answer to you is, I'd love it if Eva's daughter joined us and we can have another convert to the world of museums. Another short answer is, I can just smell it. I can tell without knowing what an object does. So without, or even caring about what an object does, I can just sense sometimes that I think there might be a story in that. And I can't describe why that is, but I just can. And 5 times out of 10, I'll then do the research afterwards and find out that I was wrong. It's not that interesting, or it's not that relevant to what I wanted. But 5 times out of 10, I'll find out, oh, yeah, that is interesting. And the third answer to your comment is, it's about that very clear, logical or theoretical underpinning of the gallery. And it's about making that quite broad, because if I was to say that any object which can say anything about the work of mathematical practitioners might be a candidate for this gallery, then that means that you can probably find a maths story in almost any object. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes you have to work harder to make a maths story. It's easy to make a maths story out of a telescope or a clock, but it's quite hard to make a maths story out of a scalpel or a pair of forceps. But if you believe in your fundamental vision that maths, the work of mathematicians underpins everything and always has, you can find those stories. So let your instincts tell you that. So I showed you, I skipped over, I'll not show you now, I skipped over a picture of a model of a ship, a bright red model of a ship, which is about 3 meters long. That ship model, which is an oil tanker from the 1970s, I just know as a curator that visitors love that physically. They're drawn towards it. It's a very attractive object. So I knew that had to go into this gallery. I didn't know what the math story was yet. But of course, I was able to find a math story, and it became a really significant one about the shape of the hull. It became a hydrodynamics. It became a story of the work of mathematicians in the 19th century to model fluid flow over ships, which changed the design of ships, which enabled the modern global economy to work. It enabled us to be an importing nation in the UK because everything comes in by ship.
We have 5 minutes left. There's one question or one comment from the chat from Leopold, which is a guest. He misses the online presentation or the virtual space of the Math Gallery. That's the first point. And I quote, the history of math I can read in books, therefore I don't need an expensive gallery. Whereas the 21st century modern interactive math lives in the virtual space, computer simulations and so on.
Okay.
It's not friendly written, but maybe you comment on
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. I can see that comment. There is an online presentation on the Science Museum website. There's a whole series of descriptions of objects and of narrative stories linking many of those objects together. There are films. There's all sorts online. So have a look. Perhaps the navigation of the Science Museum website prevented you from finding that, but I assure you that it is there. Whether objects are boring is of course subjective, and of course it's unfair, I think, unless you've visited the gallery, and this is a comment based on your visit, I think it's perhaps unfair to judge the gallery on the basis of my presentation today, which showed 6 objects from 120 without any of the 3-dimensional interpretation around it. This isn't the history of maths. You will not find this history of mathematics in any book except the book that we wrote to accompany the gallery. The gallery was expensive, but it was paid for by somebody else, not the state. And I really would like to challenge the idea that somehow mathematics today is virtual. The point of this gallery is not to focus on the mathematical content that mathematicians are doing, because in your 10-minute visit, as somebody who hates mathematics, it seems that you're going to fail by trying to describe the maths that mathematicians are doing now. As we said at the start of the presentation, the idea of this gallery is for people to understand and accept that mathematics is more important in their lives than they thought. So where is the 21st century? It's throughout this gallery. When you visit the gallery and you see the presentations of each of the objects, even objects which are 300 or 400 years old, it's very easy for you to read the words that we've written and see they still have relevance today. Whether that's in the world of modeling or the solving of equations or whatever. So I hope you'll get a chance to visit.
Thank you, David, for answering. Is there any urgent
sorry, I see that there's another comment from the same person telling us that Zaha Hadid was just playing with mathematics and we should have chosen a mathematician as the lead architect. I think I don't think that's fair. I think it was astonishing working with somebody who had an understanding of the worldview of a mathematician. And of course, I don't even know what meta-level in n dimensions means, but I think that perhaps talking in those ways is part of the problem.
Any other comment from also the participant side and student side? A question? Okay, then sorry for here it's getting more louder in my surrounding now. I'm very sorry, but David, thank you very much for your insight, and yeah, I really like your approach also to working with the objects in the permanent exhibition, because I mean, as you said in the beginning, it should stay there maybe 30 years. So that's a really long time, and we're also working on a concept now at the moment for the Vienna Museum of Technology for the new permanent exhibition, also for the Maths Gallery, for the Physics and Chemistry and Heavy Industry Gallery, and it should also be there for 10 or 20 years. And I really know how difficult it is to get a permanent display, which is also on time in 10 or 15 years. So I really like your concept, and I also always use it also as a role model, how to deal with the historic objects in the permanent exhibition. And I think yours will last very long in this timeless concept. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, so lunchtime.
Thank you very much all for coming and for giving up your Sunday mornings. I've really appreciated it.